Welcome to Demonology Today Radio with your host, Kenneth and Farah Deel, demonologist at large. The goal of Demonology Today is to better pass on our knowledge to the listener, provide better knowledge and understanding of demonic hauntings and haunting in general, a Demonology 101, if you will. But we'll try to keep it comprehensive for everyone, regardless of faith, to a certain extent even universal. However, much of the topics, theories, theology are provided with that primary Christian Judeo perspective. And that's the goal, to keep from confusing people. A jinn is a demon, ghost or ghost. They can be evil or good. Pretty much simple as that. So we'll bring it over to my wife. By the way, for the inquisitors out there, we're almost finishing our 6th textbook. And that should be wrapped up, we're hoping, by the end of September, just because we need to do some last-minute things on it. And that's the Investigation Protocols book. To you, Farah.
Thank you. We'd like to welcome our guest tonight, Bob Cranmer. And in order to let our guests know a little bit about Bob didn't just drop out of the sky and say, ooh, I've got a great ghost story to tell. He actually lived it, walked it. This story that we're about to let you hear about has roots from many years past. Mr. Cranmer has a very colorful history serving in all sorts of areas. He is a very intelligent, articulated, and educated man. So this man has lived a difficult life. And from the back of the book, we have a little bit of information for an intro for you. Mm-hmm. The Cranmers seemed fated to own this house that we will talk about tonight at 3406 Brownsville Road. Now, as a young boy, Bob had been always drawn to that property, and just when his family decided to move back to Brentwood, the house was up for sale. They purchased it.
How convenient.
Exactly. Pretty soon after, the family had been experiencing all kinds of strange phenomena. This phenomena increased in violence, escalating into physical assaults, and most disturbingly, bleeding walls. Bob, Lisa, and their 4 children were under attack from a vicious, malicious demon that had been conjuring up terrifying manifestations to just absolutely destroy their tight-knit household. They had only 2 choices, either leave or draw on their unwavering faith to exorcise this malicious demonic fiend who had haunted their home. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome Mr. Bob Cranmer. Thank you very much for joining us from the Demon of Brownsville Road. Welcome to the show, Bob.
Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I thank you for that dramatic intro as well.
I try. I'm a thespian.
Yeah. I just sitting here thinking, and how many people are listening to your show that tend to lean towards interest in this subject, and then others who may happen upon your show and they hear this and they think, what in the world is this all about? And that's why I wrote this book, for those people that have, like I, at one point in time, had real no interest or knowledge of this whole subject. I saw the movies as a kid, The Exorcist and the Amityville Horror, but it was just movies.
Of course.
And then we buy this house, and over a number of years we come to realize that it's a haunted house, and it was more of a curiosity. It didn't seem to be threatening to us, and things would go bump in the night and would move and so on, but it didn't seem to be that big of a deal. We just learned to live with it. But over a period of time, it became less and less harmless and more malevolent and dangerous. And so we go through this whole long drawn out battle, as we call it, because we didn't sell the house to some other unsuspecting family like it was sold to us.
Good.
We didn't retreat. One time I did think about maybe burning it down. But we come out the other end of this horrendous experience. And again, I'm speaking to those people again who may happen upon your show, that I wrote this book I believe, in a very believable manner. And I wrote a lot about my background as to who I am, to add credibility to it. I'm a very well-known person in Western Pennsylvania. And I wrote it to let people know this stuff is real. Good and evil exist. God and the devil, angels and demons. It isn't someone's fascination or their imagination or some type of wild
fantasy
theories. This is real. This is reality. It's like the movie The Matrix. We live in this world of this unseen world around us that is good and evil, battling for the souls of us, of humankind, of mankind. And that's what it's all about. That's what it is.
You have got a lot of credibility. What I did not tell our listeners is that you are the esteemed U.S. Army second lieutenant.
I was a career military officer. Yes, a career military officer for almost 10 years. And then my wife and I decided that we really didn't want to pursue that life for our children. And we determined and decided we want to go home. We want to go back to where I grew up. And when we moved back,
this is when you found the house?
This house that I had always been drawn to. In fact, my mother, who was a retired real estate agent at the time, said to me, "Oh, by the way, Bobby, your house is coming up for sale." And she referred to it as my house because she knew how drawn I was to it. And we bought it, and some way...
How old were you at the time when you bought the house?
I was 32 years old.
And your 32. Children, what ages were they?
Well, we had a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 2-week-old. He was born in October.
With those children and as much noise as they make, it's a miracle you could tell the difference between the demons and the children.
Well, as the years went on, those children got worse. And as it began to this entity began to sow discord in the house and amongst our family and to attack certain members of my family mentally. It was horrendous.
Set up the picture for our listeners. How long? Was it 6 months, a year before you started noticing the little things that were happening in the house? Set up our listeners.
That was within weeks. And
really?
Again, I do my best in this story, not just to present a scary haunted house story, because one, this wasn't a haunted house. This was a possessed house. And there's a difference. There's a difference between a demon and a ghost. This was vicious, this was dangerous, and that's what we bought, a possessed house. We weren't, I would say that it even went to the process of when we bought the house that red flags began to go up. My wife said to me, I just don't feel comfortable with this house. It was a, 3-story large old Victorian mansion with, large rooms and almost 10-foot ceilings and one of those big houses you walk into and there's a foyer and you look up to the second floor balcony. There's a railing that surrounds the balcony and you can look down surrounds the foyer. So it's one of those big old stone houses with big white pillars in the front. It's on the cover of the book. And my wife said, it's not like we're moving into this house. I feel like it's letting us in. So there was an eerie feeling we had from the beginning. And I felt that, and in the process, after, I made my offer, to buy it, and, you obviously, when you're making an offer to buy a house, you're going to negotiate, so you know what you can pay, and you make an offer of, so many, $20,000-$30,000 less, and I made that lowball offer, because they really didn't have a price on the house yet, because it wasn't on the market. And as soon as I gave them my first offer, the guy said, "Sold. We'll take it." Which was a flag in and of itself.
Yeah, that should have been your first clue.
Yeah. So later on, as you know, I was in the house, and we were going through, and he was the owner they had been in the house for 9 years, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, they're leaving. You know, they bought this house, and it was pretty much in disrepair, and they had to spend years, you know, doing plaster work and electrical work and plumbing work, and so all of a sudden they get the house to where it's, you know, livable, and they're leaving, and they're not wasting any time in wanting to get out. So I said to the gentleman, I said, "Jim, is there anything wrong with this house?" Now you would think he would say, "What do you mean, the roof? You know, what do you mean wrong with the house?" You know, I just went over all the mechanics and the structural review of the house, and he knew right away what I meant. And he said, "Oh no, there's nothing wrong with this house. In fact, we've had mass in the living room several times, and my young sons had their first communion."
A red flag.
Yeah, and I said, "You've had mass in the living room.
How likely is that?"
Yeah, and I thought to myself, well, they were very devout, and they were an Irish family, and I thought, well, you know, maybe it's some type of an Irish tradition, and I let it go because I was determined to own this house that I had always wanted to go in for as long as my memory went back to maybe when I was 7, 8 years old, when I was old enough to roam the streets by myself. You know, I would stand in front of this house and just stare at it, and just intrigued by it, and always drawn to it. That's why my mother called it my house. Your house is for sale. So, I guess, you know, fast forward a couple months, and we're in the house, and we were not Catholic. We were evangelical Christians, and my mother was Catholic, and she said, "You know, Bob, it would be a good idea for you to have one of the priests from my parish come and bless your house." And, you know, I didn't believe in all that Catholic hocus pocus, but to make her happy, and to tell you the truth, I thought, you know, I was raised Catholic until I was about 18, and I left the church, and I thought, you know, it can't do any harm.
Right.
So, very nice, priest came, and it was a very, you know, we were going through the house, the kids and my wife and I, and very kind of upbeat, and we were on the second floor, going to each bedroom, and he would go in with his holy water and bless each room and say a prayer. And there was one room in the front of the house that years later, in talking to previous owners, really the owners that had the house prior to those that we bought it from, there was one kind of ominous bedroom that they never would use as a bedroom. It would be maybe a sitting room or so on, and it had an odd feel to it. And we had given this bedroom to my 3-year-old son, Bobby, who again is on the front cover of the book. And as we approached his room, this 3-year-old boy darted in front of his door, which, as I can recall, the door was closed.
Mm-hmm.
And he stood in the doorway and made like an X with his body, with his arms and his leg on the door frame, and said, "You can't come in this room." And said it as determined as an adult. And he looked dead right at the priest and said, "You can't come in this room." And I was shocked. You know, a 3-year-old boy doing something like this, and I when I was going to remove him and say, "Get out of the way," the priest, you know, not wanting to make a scene, said, "Oh, don't worry." And he blessed the door of the room, and we went on our way. But that was another red flag, because this demon would target that particular son. He moved into that room. He wouldn't sleep in the bed. Probably almost for the first year, he slept in the closet on the floor with the light on. And my wife put a crib mattress on the floor. He wouldn't sleep in the bed. There was something about that room, and years later we found out it was a very ominous room, and a lot of bad stuff happened in it.
That's weird about the closet, because usually the closet's the one that you want to stay out of it.
Yeah. So, also, I would say that the first paranormal incident that we experienced, probably in January. We moved in December, and probably I think in January, it was winter, and there's a large oak staircase with 17 steps that goes up to a landing and then cuts back and goes up to the second floor, and it's a big, impressive staircase. And under that staircase, there is a closet, a walk-in closet, and that was where, obviously, we would keep our coats. And in the closet is a light that's similar to an old gas light. The house had gas lights when it was first built, later converted. And it's one with a Victorian shade that points down towards the floor, and there's a pull chain on it, regular just chain that you pull, obviously, and familiar with that, to turn the light on. And when you open up the door, and it's dark, you can't immediately see into the closet, so you just reach in where the light is and find the chain and pull it. So several times I would come home from work at night, and I would reach in to turn the light on to hang my coat up, and the chain wouldn't be there. And I would feel around for it, and I would always find the chain either wrapped around the top of the light, or it would be very meticulously wrapped around one of the little screws that would hold in the shade, so that you couldn't pull the light. It's like something didn't want you to turn the light on in the closet. So after that happened 3 or 4 times, I said to my wife, and she kept our vacuum cleaner in that closet, and I said, please, Lisa, when you put the vacuum away, or when you're in that closet, don't pull the chain and let it fly, because what happens is it wraps around the top of the light, and I can't get it. And the day I said that to her, she said, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't been in that closet in 2 days. So I said, okay, this is the deal. I'm getting my cooler there. I got my coat. I said, there's the light. Don't go in this closet today. And, our children were all small, and they could never even reach this light, which was, 5 feet off the floor. And sure enough, when I came home from work that night, I opened up the closet door, and we both looked, and the chain was wrapped around the light. And it continued to be. So with that, we realized we have a haunted house. There's no other explanation. I didn't do it. She didn't do it. And it happened. So then, over the coming years, we would have things where it would come down in the morning and the lights would all be on. The water would be running in various places. The radio would be turned on in my workshop. Furniture would be moved. But again, it didn't seem to be threatening. We kind of referred to it as Casper the Friendly Ghost. Whoever it is, we're not really concerned. But looking back, hindsight, it was slowly beginning its process of dominating several of the children, causing discord within our family, which ultimately was, looking to expel us from the house as it had the previous owners. And it took years before it got to kind of a meltdown point. But finally, after so many years and so many things that occurred that I didn't initially attribute to the spirit, in hindsight, it was all like a very systematic process it was going through. And my wife at one point, after we had been in the house, I don't know, about 6 years, and here she is, I'm in my mid-30s, she was still in her late 20s, and she has a nervous breakdown out of the blue. It was just bizarre. She spends 2 weeks in a psychiatric ward, and it, oh, by the way, coincided with us moving into that front bedroom. We had a master bedroom, and my wife had planned some big renovations to the room, and we moved out of our room so we could do those renovations, and we moved into that front room. And over a period of a couple months, her personality completely changed, her countenance changed, and eventually she had, again, what appeared to be a nervous breakdown. I hope I answered your question as to how it initially began to manifest itself in subtle ways and in very apparent ways. But looking back on it, it all is very clear the process it was following.
Yeah.
What sort of experiences did your young son, you say that your young son, who is actually on the cover of your book, wouldn't allow the priest to enter his bedroom? Would he wake you up in the middle of the night? What was going on with this little boy?
This very happy, friendly, this kid was just a real little ball of energy. And once we moved in the house slowly, his demeanor, his countenance, everything about him just became very, very serious and somewhat ominous. As long as he was in that bedroom, I even had some of our neighbors come to me, and here he is, 6-year-old boy or whatever, and they're saying, you gotta really have him talk to him, maybe get him some help. He's got some issues. And it would come and go, but as he got older, it got to the point where he was, at one point, and again, this is when he was a teenager, at one point we actually thought that he might be possessed. It got that bad. And, we found out after the fact that this thing would materialize and he could see it. It would come into the room when he was there. And he kept all this stuff bottled up inside him for years. And, really, I almost killed him. And it was a really, really serious situation. We had him seeing psychiatrists and he was on medication. And then it went after my youngest son as well. It really targeted 2 of my children. 2 of them, it seemed, I wouldn't say to leave alone. They certainly saw the entity and it would manifest itself to them, but it didn't seem to affect them mentally as it did my other 2 sons. And again, detailed in the book how it played out.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's pretty intense and amazing. There is a commonality that you just pointed out. Children that are attacked a lot of times are oppressed for such a length of time that we seek humanist approaches and we seek those solutions thinking that medication can help it, behavior modification therapy can help it. How many years into living into this house did you realize that maybe there was something a little bit more that was going on? When did you start getting the clue that there's something really dangerous here?
Well, finally, what happened was, once it really attacked them, it completely unmasked itself. And this was years into it. I mean, this was, in the year 2003. Mm-hmm. All hell broke out. All hell broke loose in the house. It was just, like a volcano. And this thing, did not try to disguise its existence. It was very, first person, interpersonal. It would interact with me. It was like living in a house with the invisible man. This wasn't some ghost that was roaming around looking, for a lost love or some such thing, and you'd see it occasionally. This was interactive. This thing dealt with us almost on a daily basis. And as we came to understand how to battle it and how to push back, as we pushed it pushed. And that's when, it would continuously escalate, until the house just got to the point where it was almost unlivable. And as I look back on what we went through, I probably should have moved at least my kids out of the house during that time. But, I saw it as a war, of who owns this house. Is this our house or is this your house? And I'm not going to retreat from the house, and we're not going to give an inch. It was a battle of determination, that, seemed to, at one point, it just seemed to have no end. It just seemed like it was just continuing to escalate. And it was quite a, hellish, experience.
Tell us about one of your first interactions with this thing. You say there was constant interactions. Were they verbal? Were they reactionary? Were they more of on a thought process sort of wavelength? What were they?
Well, I would say as it got to the point where I would personally interact with this thing, kind of on almost a daily basis, how it would manifest itself to me. And again, this is during the time period that I call the battle, once we began to engage it. And I, enlisted or sought out the help of the Catholic Church, the Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh. And the bishop assigned several priests to work with us. So we were in the process of, we would utilize all the ritualistic weapons of the church, holy water and incense and, mass being said, all types of prayer, rosary. Eventually it came to possess for not only the front bedroom that I pointed out earlier, but then subsequently what was our master bedroom. And when I say it would possess it, how this thing would manifest itself to me, it would appear not in a visible form, even though it did appear numerous times in various forms that could be seen. On a regular basis, it would make its presence known as what I call a pillar of stench. And it had this unbelievable sulfuric, burning rubber, kind of electric burning smell to it, that would just embed itself in your nostrils when you smelled it.
Almost like somebody being electrocuted.
Yeah,
like
when you have when an extension cord or you have an electric fire and that smell of burning rubber, but this was also a sulfuric smell. And it wouldn't, say if it's in the room, and if you have flowers in a room or you spray air freshener in a room, it'll fill the whole room. But in this case, or if even a woman's wearing perfume, you can smell the perfume several feet away. This was very localized. It was almost like, when you're speaking to someone that has terrible, bad breath or body odor. You really only smell it when you're right next to them.
Exactly.
So this smell would move around the room, and I could tell when I was next to it because the smell was so strong. And what I would do is I would have holy water in hand. Many times my wife would be with me. It would be in the room with us. We would pray the rosary interactively back and forth, and there was a struggle that would go on to see if I could force this thing to leave the room. And many times this struggle would go on for several hours, and I would hit it with the holy water, and it would dart across the room, and we had all the furniture out of the room. It was like a big boxing ring.
Nice.
You would walk through the room, and I would sniff it out. And when I would smell it again, I'd hit it again. And this would go on, and it was a nightly struggle, and it was all about dominance. And sometimes it would win, and sometimes I would win. And this went on and on for months. And we learned different things, different tactics that we could utilize. One of the things it found very abhorrent and would, I guess, drive it crazy was the movie The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson's movie. And we would play that movie in at one time in both bedrooms, but primarily in that front bedroom. We had a player, a CD player, DVD player, that we could put on repeat, and that movie and the television played that movie 24 hours a day, nonstop. And I would go in the room and say the rosaries and, do what I was instructed to do. And, every other day we would find the TV would be turned off, the DVD player would be turned off. Even sometimes we would find the CD taken out of the player and, we'd find it on the floor. So I knew that this thing did not like that movie because it represents the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ on the cross, the deliverance of mankind against the devil, and that was abhorrent. And anything holy, crucifixes, it would bend them in half. It would break them. It would throw them on the floor. Rosary beads. There were times when I was saying the rosary and the rosary beads literally would fall apart in my hands and fall to the floor. On a daily basis, I generally would take rosary beads to bed with me and pray them as I fell asleep. Every morning I would awake to find that the rosary beads, for those that are familiar with rosary beads, little beads that are connected with small, like miniature links of chain, those links would be forced together to form several figure eights so that the beads could not be prayed as intended. They were forced together, and I had a pair of little jeweler pliers that every day I would have to take those beads apart, bend the links back together again, and every morning I would wake up and they would be forced back together again. So it didn't like rosary beads. It didn't like me praying the rosary. And again, I was not Catholic. I was a Protestant. I thought that all this Catholic ritual and Catholic hocus pocus was, something that, was all kind of religious superstition. But I soon found out that they're powerful weapons. And, it just became something that I leaned upon and realized that if it was trying to prevent me from doing a certain thing, that's what I was going to do.
That's interesting about that, and the reason is because we wrote a all-denominational book. They're textbooks. They don't relay stories of individual cases as much as they might refer shortly about stories to give case study examples. But the sacramentals, when we were writing that, we realized all they had was the Bible and a cross. And the cross is like the letter T to the demonic, unless it's been used a lot for, prayer. Then it might be sort of empowered by being proximity to praying something positive, but it's not the same as a, crucifix, which they don't like by default, even in blessed. And rosaries, those are sacramentals, St. Benedict medals. Something else I was going to mention for our listeners out there from a case study standpoint also is that when you get one that defiles things, not just turning crucifix upside down, when it can actually destroy it and bend
break
it and
them
break
in half. We had them broken in half.
Yeah, this is a higher ranking demonic spirit. And, it's probably You might bring it up at some point or another, but my first thought would be occult practice and talking about the darker, not the love and light, lighter things. But have you found any history about previous
the
owners?
House and what happened in the house? Oh, yeah. I mean, I was an intelligence officer, military intelligence officer, and, I was trained to look for every piece of information you can, and it's a puzzle. You get as much information you can, and sooner or later you're going to have a picture of which I believe we have pretty much the whole story of what took place, not only concerning this in this house, but what even happened on the land long, long before the house was built. Mm-hmm. But I want to make one more point when you're talking about the Sacramento and the power of this demon. When we would have Mass in the house, and we had Mass usually in the living room, but eventually we had Mass on the third floor, the second floor, the first floor, and eventually in the final scene we had Mass in the basement. But there was one particular time in the middle of this battle when we had Mass. I remember it was a July day, during the day, and my wife and I and the priest were celebrating Mass in this particular room where I used to struggle with this pillar of stench. Mm-hmm. Now, usually it would manifest itself and kind of have a temper tantrum the day after or after we would have the Mass. Yeah. But on this particular day, and it was pretty amazing, that during the consecration, the holiest part of the Mass, it made itself known by its pillar of stench. It was present in the room during the Mass, particularly during the consecration of the water or of the wine and the host, the water and the wine and the host, which told me, and I noticed it. I looked at my wife and she shook her head. She smelled it as well. To hear this thing is bold enough to be present, and it was just trying to demonstrate its power. Now, how much energy it had to expend to do that, I don't know. It only did it once, but it in fact did it, and it was quite the experience.
Yeah, they gain all their muster of strength to sometimes suck up the pain that involves being in proximity to, say, the host during communion rite transubstantiation, just to try to intimidate you further. I can see a strategy in that, yes. It sounds like quite a battle. Please continue.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, you asked me another question and I went off on that. I was about ready to...
Your detective work.
Yes. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, that's
okay.
what I... Okay, now what we found out, what we discovered, and this was pretty interesting because we discovered this really, I wrote the book to begin with based upon, I kept a diary through the whole time period. And I had 350 pages of notes of what took place on certain days, and it was kind of a technical record, and I had to transform that into a narrative. Well, anyway, long after we were actually working on the book, and I had a writer that was working with me, and we had the publishing deal. We found out there is in the front yard of the house a several 100-year-old oak tree, big, over almost 12 feet around, big old red oak. And legend in the town was that there was always something special about that particular tree. And there were stories that said it had something, everything had something to do with George Washington. And George Washington did make several trips to the area. He owned land in Allegheny County, and, they said, well, George Washington once was here, and that's why they didn't cut the tree down. So, anyway, we later found out, and we were working with this woman who is detailed in the book, and she's called a Christian intuitive, a mystic. She can see things. Not a psychic. She's a very holy lady, and she worked with the priest during our process. Well, she told me that long ago, and the road that the house is built on, Brownsville Road, was once like the main road into Pittsburgh from all points south. And Pittsburgh initially started out as a Fort Pitt, and it was like the westernmost border of the English possessions, and it was at the headwater of the Ohio River, and it was very important because the Ohio was a gateway to the west and eventually into the Mississippi. So Pittsburgh was very important. So this road that came went to the fort. And after the Revolution, as she pointed out to me, she said that what happened was, buried at that tree is a mother and her 3 daughters. And they were killed by Native Americans during one of the many wars between the settlers and the Indians, American Indians. And they were massacred, and they're buried in that yard. And the father was not killed. He came home to find them all dead, and he buried them there. And he planted a sapling oak tree at the grave as a memorial to them. And I said, well, you know, okay. And she said that evil associated with that murder, with that massacre, attached itself to the land and eventually invaded the house. So I said, okay, well, this is an interesting story. Let's see what I can find out. Well, I took the time and I began to research, and I looked into the archives of what used to call the War Department. And they have records that go all the way back to the beginning of the country. And after the Revolutionary War, when George Washington was our first president, and prior to the Revolution, the English would not let any settlement take place west of the Allegheny Mountains. They had a treaty with the Indians, the tribes, that there would be no settlements in western Pennsylvania or in Ohio or anywhere that was off limits. But when the Americans, America was formed, the United States was a country, they had no such treaty with the Indians. In fact, the Indians in many cases helped the British. So they sold a lot of that land to help pay off war debt, or they awarded land to soldiers who had fought in the Revolution. So all of a sudden you have this mass movement of settlers from into western Pennsylvania and into Ohio, and eventually moving on up into Michigan. So with that, a large war in the late 1780s, the first big war the United States was involved with, started with the Indian tribes. It was called the Northwest Indian War. And it was a horrendous war. The United States Army suffered its greatest defeats in all the Indian wars that we were involved in through the 1800s. Its greatest defeats were in this particular war. And basically the American Indians pushed the settlers all the way back to western Pennsylvania, and Fort Pitt was actually re-garrisoned and rebuilt as the westernmost frontier of the United States, and it was a big war and very vicious. And so I said all that to say that I was looking at some letters that were written by the commander of Fort Pitt to the Secretary of War at the time, and he sent, weekly letters, and most of them said, we need more troops, we need more supplies, things are bad. But at the end of one of the letters, there was a notation that said, this week it was reported. Now, my house is about 7 miles from the fort along what was this main road. And it said, this week, a mother and her 3 children were killed by the Indians. The father, whose name was Deliverance Brown, was spared, being some distance from the house. Now, that's the exact story that this woman had told me.
That's
and
heavy.
I found it in this letter. And what was unique about it is that traditionally the Indians would kill and massacre men, but they would always take women and children. They would take the women hostage. They generally would take the children and just incorporate them into their tribes and turn them into, family members. So when they actually killed women and children, they were doing that to terrorize the settlers, to say, we're going to kill all of you. So it was a big deal. So, okay, I find this letter. So I took it a step further, and I saw this on the History Channel at one point. I hired a company called Ground Penetrating Radar Systems. Now, ground penetrating radar, they generally work for contractors and so on, and they find pipes and different things that are buried under the ground, and they have these sophisticated radar devices that send signals down into the ground. They can tell you what's there. They can tell you how deep it is. They can tell you if the ground has ever been disturbed. So I paid them to come and to scan this area in front of the tree, and lo and behold, they found the report a area of disturbance which measured exactly 11 feet by 6 feet, with 4 horizontal figures which they determined were 4 to 6 feet down, buried, and it had all the indications of being a grave. And they even showed me on their radar where these figures were. And with that, short of digging up skeletons, I thought that was pretty conclusive, that I have these people buried in my front yard. And I said all that to say that I believe that, not that the American Indians were so evil, but I think the evil that prompted them to commit that heinous act attached itself to the land and eventually invaded the house.
Yeah, two things on that real quick.
Sure.
Number one would be, for you listeners out there, that technology, they probably showed it on a larger scale to an audience in Jurassic Park. If it used the shotgun one, the one that creates the shock waves, and then they kind of get a look like a sonar image does for fish. I don't know if that was it, but it's pretty high tech.
This actually had a screen. You could see,
yes,
these squiggly figures in the ground exactly, and the guy took the time to say, okay, here you go. Here are the figures in the ground. And yeah, this has and also that the ground at one point, as he said, had been disturbed, had been dug up.
Wow, interesting. And there's this old story called the Black Hope Horror. There's a movie adaptation. I think it had Patty Duke in it, and they were trying to find if there were slaves buried on their property. I think they were digging in the wrong place. Too bad it didn't have these fellas. Or the technology probably wasn't available. That was a while back. 70s, I think. The other thing is the Native Americans. People need to get out of this mindset that the Native Americans were all one religion. And they were not. There's such a variety. There was the cannibal ones. Just like you said yourself, there were some that spared the children. Remember we saw Little Big Man? There was the more mild ones like we saw in the Dances with Wolves movie. Some of these stories aren't portraying them correctly either, but we have to remember there is no one Native American. You say, my heritage was Native American, somebody out there. It doesn't mean that there is some universal religion they all had. They didn't all worship the great master and the maker of the universe and love nature. They were very violent and, vile.
Vicious.
Yes, and sacrificial rites, the whole 9 yards. So people need to do their research even on their own heritage before they make such statements. That we can't assume they're all peaceniks.
I also research, especially these Indians, Iroquois Indians, and so on, and what they would do to each other. Indian tribe against Indian tribe. It was horrendous how they would flay each other. They would flay someone alive, cut their skin off, while they were alive, and they would slowly burn someone to death.
That's unappetizing.
Yeah, I mean, it was just so, it was so vicious, and certainly, there were vicious things that were committed by white men against them, in response. So,
oh yes,
there's really no one innocent, and certainly these American Indians saw themselves as fighting for what was rightfully theirs, and in fact it was theirs. So, I certainly don't want to come across as it was the evil, and that's the whole point of this book, that evil exists apart from evil intentions and evil feelings and bad feelings that individuals have. When you see on the news someone all of a sudden taking an AK-47 and going into a grade school and killing 20 young 6-year-olds, that's evil. And there's evil that causes people, to cut somebody else's head off on television.
Exactly.
We here last year we had some normal 15-year-old paper route basketball playing kid who one day, from a middle class family, one day out of the blue takes a butcher knife and goes to his high school and stabbed 20 people.
Oh my gosh.
20 kids in his school. Out of the blue.
Evil. Yep.
Out of the blue. What causes that to happen? I mean, it's beyond, again, I believe it goes on beyond the mental illness and so on. This is evil, and the more you research and get into things that people do, evil exists and good exists. Pure good exists, pure evil exists, and it's all around us.
I agree. Mm-hmm. Completely. Boy, that was pretty amazing. So, once they found those skeletons underneath a tree, was this property, I have some experience with historical properties. Did the city, the county declare this property somewhat untouchable, basically? In other words, that it had to be left in the original condition and nobody could touch or dig once you found those bones?
Well, two things. We did not do an archaeological dig. I mean, I'm not going to dig up a grave and look at the bones. I mean, I guess that could be done. I was satisfied enough with the report from the ground penetrating radar. In fact, we were told by the same woman who told us the story that the ghost of the mother was still present in the front yard. And she said, I see a woman covered in blood, screaming hysterically, continuously for her slain children.
Oh,
and
gosh.
I marked the grave. I put a brass plaque on the grave. I put their name on the plaque, and I hope that maybe that brought some closure for this woman. I never saw her, but I was told that, on a quiet, summer evening, you can still hear her wailing faintly in the yard. I never have, but I wouldn't be surprised if you could. And, another funny thing is, just another twist to the whole story, which is in the book. A year or so after we moved into the house, I all of a sudden developed this interest in the artwork of some particular Western Pennsylvania artists that depicted called Eastern Indian art. of Eastern Iroquois Indians. And there's a lot of history, obviously, in western Pennsylvania, the French and Indian War. Most of these scenes are related to that war. And I began to buy lithographs and eventually prints on canvas, and eventually I bought an original painting of a particular Indian chief. And I filled the house with this stuff. Kind of like, if you remember back that movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where Richard Dreyfuss is led to build this
mashed potato
this mashed potato thing in his living room and he doesn't know why. You know, I had this impulsive desire to buy this stuff. So we have this act of American Indians and the evil associated, and I fill the house with artwork that depicts all the same tribes that you know, it's just kind of weird. It was just kind of, and then all this art, one of the things this demon did on a regular basis, it would take those pictures, all those pictures throughout the house, and it would turn them sideways on the wall. I mean, these are big pictures. I mean, you know, they measure probably, you know, 3.5 feet by, or maybe, you know, even bigger. Big pictures, big, you know, oak frames, and it would move these pictures so that they would either hang diagonally or sideways on the walls, and that happened regularly. You know, a day after we would have Mass, I would wake up to find all the art in the house, you know, hanging sideways on the wall, and it really had a fixation on all those pictures. So again, just another interesting twist to the history. Now, yeah. I guess one of the most heinous things that we later found out took place in the house. And we found that, you know, this demon, which eventually we found out that, I mean, we discovered that its name apparently was that of an Old Testament god called Moloch. And Moloch was worshipped by the Canaanites, and Moloch would require the burnt offerings of firstborn children, where these children would actually be placed in a vessel in front of this god, and they would be burned alive. And archaeologists in the Middle East, in Palestine, have turned up hundreds and hundreds of vases filled with the bones of sacrificed children that were sacrificed to Moloch. Yeah. And we found that this thing focused upon children, not only my children, not only the children that were killed in the front yard, but that during the Depression, during the late 20s and even into the 30s, that the original owners of the house, who had money problems, especially resulting from the Depression, and they eventually lost the house for taxes, rented a room out on the second floor that happened to be the same room that my son would not let the priest in, to a doctor that performed abortions in the house.
Oh my gosh!
Boy, it gets worse.
So you had this
layer upon layer
upon layer of
merciful
you know, how many infants were killed, and then we found out later that even at least one woman died in the house as a result of a botched abortion.
I'm sure there was more than that weren't reported, especially the underage ones. Oh, merciful heavens.
One of the reasons this house was selected.
Sorry to interrupt. We have to take our top of the hour break. And can you come back for the second hour?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just
Wonderful.
getting started.
Hold that thought. Get a glass of water.
Thoughts about the possibility that you smell burning flesh, that it might have been related to you know, a past thing. We don't know, but we hope that you can connect the dots for us, since there's a lot of drama, which is rare, because most of these places, I said, don't knock out the walls of your house looking for a dead body, because the spirit is telling you they're in there. You know, you just caused several thousands of dollars of damage, and they're laughing at you.
Well, we did knock out a wall, which I can talk about.
Okay.
Okay. All right. With that, thank you, audience. Don't go anywhere. Hold on to your seats. The best is yet to come in the house at Demonology Today, streaming on
Demonology Today, back and for the second hour with Bob on the phone line with us, telling us the story of the demon of Brownsville Road. The last thing we're discussing, we're talking about the historical aspects. You started answering a question that I had, and that was, the smells that they pertain to anything that the house had history of, which telltale of a demonic spirit, the sulfur or the burning flesh, rotting flesh. One of those type of things, spirits of death. But sometimes you find that there was ritual sacrifice and property, and you're actually smelling that because that's part of the type of demon that was drawn in there through rituals or activities or murder or war.
Well, as we were told, and I was not aware at the time. This woman that I referred to the previous segment, who told us about the front yard and what went on there and so on. I did not know that over the 2 years that we were battling this thing, that she was actually advising the priests that were working with us. So they would come up with all these details about the house and things that had taken place, and at one point in time, I was told about one of the reasons this house was seen as a convenient place to have a, illegal abortion clinic was it's a large house, and the driveway wraps around the back of the house and went back to what originally was when the house was built. They had horses and buggies and so on, a stable, but eventually cars could drive around the back of the house and people could, enter and exit the house without, discreetly. So there was a large porch, on the back of the house, kind of integral to the makeup of the house. It wasn't an external porch, which eventually was closed in and made into a 3-season room. And there was a doorway, after they closed off the porch, and put up walls and windows, there was a doorway that had steps leading up to it, obviously, so you could still get into what had been a porch and get into the back of the house. So, years later, as we were in the house, and eventually this room was heated, and there were large hot water radiators put into it. It still was cold in the wintertime, and we used it kind of as a playroom for the kids. And I decided to had wooden walls on the interior of it, so I figured I'm going to take off all this old wood, I'm going to insulate it, and then I'm going to put up drywall, new walls. So when we pulled down this wood, lo and behold, we find a door in the wall. Apparently when they decided to close up the inside of the room, instead of removing this doorway, they just built right over top of it. Now, the reason I tell you this is that later on, as we were working with these priests, they were talking about this abortion doctor and how the women would come and go through this rear door in the house, that they called the door of sorrows. And there is one doorway that goes into the kitchen of the house that was not really in those days, a kitchen was a place, this house had servants and so on, and it did not access really conveniently the rest of the house. So when they told me about this door in the back of the house, I knew it was there because I had pulled the walls down, and then when I put the drywall back up again, the wall board, I just went over top of the door as well. So they were telling me this stuff that was coming from this woman about details of the house, about this door that was in the wall. And I knew it was there. My wife knew it was there because we had seen it. So she went on to tell us, or she went on to tell them, and they told us, that apparently a lot of these abortions were late-term abortions, and there were actually, you know, it was more than something you could just, you know, dispose of, I guess, in a trash can or whatever, and they would actually, he had an assistant, and they would burn these bodies, the remains of the aborted fetuses, babies, in the coal furnace in the basement of the house.
Oh, horrible.
And for years, later on, after a year or so of living in the house, and you can imagine what our gas bills were, I installed this is hot water heat, so it's a gas furnace that heats hot water in a boiler. I installed beside the gas furnace a coal or wood fueled boiler that was integrated into the heating system of the house. So in the cold months of the winter, I would actually there was a big room that had been used to store coal in, and I put wood in it. I began to burn wood to help cut my gas bill down, which, you know, is $400 or $500 a month.
Oh yeah.
And when I would come down in the morning, and this started to happen, you know, not long, you know, I guess I put that in a few years after we moved in. I would come down into the basement in the morning, generally to put some more wood on the fire, and I had a workbench in this furnace room, and there was a chair at the work table, and I would always find that chair sitting right in front of that wood furnace. Like someone would sit there and they were looking at the furnace. And I would come down and I'd always find the chair in front of the furnace, and the radio would be playing or something. And it was indicative, as I found out later, representative of this assistant that would burn these remains, and then apparently if they were significant, they would take the remains, the bones or whatever, and bury them in the backyard of the house. And this went on for years. And, you know, I wrote this book, and we did it carefully because I didn't want this book to have, you know, to get all wrapped up in the debate over, you know, pro-life and pro-choice, and like I had some kind of secret agenda. You know, I'm personally, you know, pro-life, but I didn't want this book to be seen as, you know, some type of, you know, motivated. So that's part of the book, that's part of the story, but it's only part of the story. Because this thing did focus upon children, and later on it focused upon my children. It went after my grandson at one point. This thing just had it out for kids, and we discovered all of this as time went on, and it was just an evil entity. Now, I will say that when I first went to the church, and you know, I was a fairly high place at one point, political. I held political office in Allegheny County, which includes the city of Pittsburgh. I was a county commissioner.
Wonderful.
I was chairman of the county commissioner, and so I'm still very well known in the area. But after I was good friends with the mayor of Pittsburgh, and I was no longer in office when this started, and I told him what was happening after a period of time, and he said, I have to go see the bishop. So he went to see Bishop Donald Worrell, who is now Cardinal Worrell. He's the Archbishop in Washington, D.C. And he went and talked to Bishop Worrell, and eventually I was told that a priest would call me. And a priest did call me. His name's Father Ron Langwin. He's now the Vicar General of the diocese. And I thought that, the priests would come, they would come in, they would do whatever they do. It's kind of like calling the Terminex guy. They're going to come in and they're going to do whatever they're going to do, and maybe they have to do it twice, and they're going to rid the house of whatever this is. Well, during one of the initial conversations I was having with Father Langwin, he said to me, this is a very, very powerful, evil entity. This is not a ghost. And I can tell you this is not going to be easy. And in a year from now, we'll know if we're making progress. I said, what do you mean?
Wow.
In a year. He said, this is powerful. He said, you have a decision to make. It's kind of like in the Matrix, the red pill or the blue pill. He said, you can try to sell this house and move on and forget about it, or you can stay. And I can't guarantee success. Now, I had a faith that my faith tells me that good overcomes evil. So I always believed that ultimately the Lord would prevail, as happened. But I in no way anticipated or ever dreamt that this was going to be such a battle, such a war. I believe the Bible says, resist the devil and he shall flee from you.
Exactly.
The Word of God will chase the devil, and he's as a roaring lion. He's not a roaring lion. Hey, I'm telling you what, this thing didn't run. It didn't go. It fought tenaciously like a wild beast. And it was, some days it won, some days we won. But I can tell you, a year later, after I had that conversation, we were ready to give up. And it knew we were ready to give up. And that's when it began to throw this bloody-like substance over the walls. It didn't seep out of the walls. It was actually applied to the walls. Somewhat like if you are familiar, as I referenced, of the priest throwing holy water, in the house, as the priests did multiple times.
Yes.
They'd go through and they'd bless the house, and they would throw with that instrument, whatever it's called, that soaks up the water, and they throw it up onto the walls and the ceiling. And it's water, though. It doesn't leave a mark. If you can imagine filling that same container with a blood-like brown, reddish substance and throwing it all over the walls, that's what we experienced. And it would run down the walls. It was insane.
What did your priests think about that? That's just pretty horrible. Did they come over immediately and perform another exorcism?
Well, we did, but then it started on the third floor and made its way down to the second floor and eventually to the first floor, and that's when it really, really was crazy. And at that point in time, they wanted some outside verification from non-church, non-family, people who weren't associated with this situation to come into the house and say, yeah, there's some crazy stuff going on here, and to see all this and to experience it. So long before Ryan Buell and his group from Penn State University were famous, and they were just, students and master students at Penn State, they were known. Again, they had no television show or anything, which eventually became Paranormal State. I contacted Ryan Buell, and they came 2 weekends in January and February of 2005. And it was insane. They came in, they were ghost hunters. They came in with their infrared cameras and their heat detectors and all this stuff, thinking they were hocus pocus. They're going to see a haunted house. They had no idea what they were getting involved in.
What happened?
And, well, I would say that probably the most dramatic thing that happened, Adam Bly, who has since left their group, when they became famous, that group, Adam knew the serious nature of this whole business, especially from being involved in our house. And he went on to study in Rome and become a demonologist. But to answer your question, at one point in time when he was like the faculty advisor for the paranormal research group of Brian Buell, they were having a meeting in the house, and they caught this on tape. This thing would scratch us and bite us on a regular basis. But it actually scratched Adam Bly's head, 3 big scratches right across his forehead, and blood ran down into his eyes.
The piety is what it's about. And that can vary even with priests. You know, if you go in there half-cocked on the faith and that sort of thing, it doesn't matter how brave or knowledgeable he thinks he is. Of course, we know he's a mixed bag of belief systems, as we know now. But back in the day, I was going to have him on the radio show, and he was
is this Ryan Buell you're talking about?
Yes. He was actually sporting on MySpace that he was Wiccan before we contacted him, and then he changed it to Catholic during his first season of Paranormal State. So he was kind of just wishy-washy with his belief systems and apparently a lot of other things.
I'm going to say this. I know that Ryan has his issues, and I do know that he had some wishy-washy, changeable belief. Sometimes he was Catholic and sometimes he was something else. But I will say that the time period, the 2 weeks that they were there, and whether this was just by their naivety, they really helped flush this thing out. And I can detail to you some things that we did. I had an agreement with Ryan that he would not divulge or disclose anything about our house other than referencing that there was a house in Pittsburgh. So he never divulged anything about our story at all. I commend him for that because it was a big deal for them. And it was much more serious and impressive than anything they ever experienced after that, real or not. But this was real, and it got to the point where the priest basically said, "We don't need you guys to come back anymore because it's too dangerous. It's dangerous for them." And they came twice and did what they did was they verified that there was some crazy stuff going on in the house, and they provided a report. So they provided the church with outside verification from a non-church, non-religious group that there was serious activity going on in the house.
2005, it was different. And I mean, this is almost 10 years ago. I think there was only 7 exorcists in the United States. So if you got an exorcist in your case, it was a big thing because typically you probably had to travel over a couple of states to get there.
Well, we
so
did.
They still scrutinized things a lot.
Yeah, they brought Father James LaBarre.
I think he passed away, didn't he?
He passed away years ago.
Yes.
Yeah, but they brought Father James LaBarre from the Archdiocese of New York.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that they had PRS in there was to say, hey, we've had this verified by non-church kind of researchers. And Father LaBarre eventually came. And, but we did talk about, us tearing a wall out at one point.
Oh, no.
And, when Ryan Buell's group came, they had apparently talked to some type of a Catholic psychic, or I never met the woman, but she did call on the phone. She's from Gettysburg. And initially she was going to come with them to the house. And apparently she had some foreboding that this was not a house she wanted to be involved with. And she said, I'm not going to that house. You guys shouldn't go either. There's some serious evil in that house. But if you do decide to go, there is a void in the center of the house that needs to be accessed, because that's where this thing, it's like its abode. It's where it stays. This thing would disappear for days on end. And there was a pattern. It would have, tremendous activity for 4 or 5 days, and then for 4 or 5 days nothing would happen. It was like it had to recharge its batteries or so on. And I knew that this thing didn't evaporate or go back to hell. It was still in the house somewhere, and apparently this is where it was. This space, I pointed out earlier that there was this closet under the steps. Well, beyond the back of the closet was this large area actually closed off underneath the steps that was completely sealed up and non-accessible in any way from the time the house was built in 1909 and 1910. And I was asked, is there a space? I said, of course. It's behind the closet. It's underneath the steps. So they said, we need to get in there. So I, broke out a saw and so on, and, it wasn't like punching through wallboard. This was, 3/4 of an inch thick plaster on plasterboard and, those wooden slat boards. And, I broke into it and cut it away, and, we found all kinds of objects.
Like what?
Like personal items. One of the most, I don't want to say frightening, but,
disturbing
objects that disturbing. Yes. We found one of pieces from my youngest son's Lego set.
That's really strange.
In this space.
That's not a coincidence.
No, and there's no way in the world that anything, as I said, there were minuscule cracks in the floorboards over the years where smoke could get up in there from the furnace room down below. But other than that, light couldn't even get into this space. And we found a number of things in there, again, all detailed in the book, some even pictures. We found a large piece of amber, almost the size of a golf ball, in this space. Now, the significance of amber, as I researched, through for hundreds, thousands of years, amber was always seen superstitiously to be some type of material that would ward off evil spirits. And even sailors would wear little pieces of amber around their neck as they went to sea. So whether that amber was how it got in there, maybe it was a possession of someone that lived in the house at one time that was experienced this activity and had the amber, and the thing took it and put it in there. We found various playing cards from different decks of cards. We found the skeleton of a bird, but I guess most dramatically we found a picture that appeared to have drawings on it that was a curse on the original owners of the house. And we were told by this woman, Connie, that one of the workmen that worked on the house put a curse on the house, and by way of this paper that was under the steps. So I know this all this sounds in and of itself kind of crazy, but I believe in the book I've done my best to fit all this together in an understandable manner that all makes sense.
No, it doesn't sound crazy at all. If anything, it really validates and verifies what a lot of our listeners, they're either curious about, they're exposed to, and they're wanting to know if they've experienced a little tiny minute bit of what you've experienced. Is this real? And you're validating it 1,000%. this is real, and it's not funny, it's not amusing, and
it's nothing to make a hobby out of either.
No.
I mean, you have in every city these ghost hunter groups and so on, and they're going to go out and find ghosts, and maybe they'll even go through some process to, expel ghosts. Well, again, I'm not sure, there are disembodied spirits that are ghosts, and for whatever reason, maybe they're in the state of purgatory, as the Catholic Church points out, that there's this area between, earth and final destiny in heaven or hell or whatever, but what we dealt with was a fallen angel. It was a powerful, evil entity, and why we went through it, and the power that this thing had, I know they have limits to what they can do. And how it's limited, is it limited by angels? Certainly this thing was so powerful, it had the power to kill us, but it couldn't. It could terrorize us to an extent. And just as the devil can tempt us, the devil can't force us to commit sin, but evil can influence us to the point that eventually they can take us over. So this entity, for whatever reason, we experienced it, we battled it, we fought it, and through the power of good, through the power of the cross, we prevailed. And there's a story to be told. And I also have to say that, certainly we had the will and determination to stay and to persevere. But any time I address this thing, any time I would direct a prayer at it, or even talk to it, as I did after a period of time, I was always sure to preface and end my statements in the name of Jesus Christ. That it wasn't me that was going to expel it from the house. It wasn't my courage. It wasn't my determination. I was working through the power of good, and it was beyond me, and that was important to keep that perspective continuously.
Yeah,
that we were there being protected
at all times. Mm-hmm. How many total exorcisms would you say from the time that you initially brought the priests on the property? How many total exorcisms would you say that it took before A, you finally moved out, and B, you felt that the place would be peaceful for the next owners?
Well, technically an exorcism can only be performed by a trained and sanctioned exorcist.
True.
So that the East Diocese is supposed to have a trained, designated exorcist, and that position is something that does not come by easily. It's not like every priest is an exorcist. Now, the priests that worked with us generally would always say Mass, and they had various prayers that they would employ that would, command spirits to leave and so on and so forth, and that was all had a place, but I can say that the only official exorcism that was performed by Father Labar, and when he came from New York. And after he did that,
mm-hmm.
He came in September of 2005. The thing wasn't gone. It was not gone, but it seemed to be confined to the basement after that, and it seemed to be severely weakened. And the final scene, the final chapter of the story, was when one of the priests that worked with us, we celebrated Mass in the basement. And it was after that Mass that the final scene was played out, and this thing finally left and was gone. And it was not some big impressive thunderclap, or, you know, if I would have written this story and made it up, I would have written some big impressive thing. It ended kind of with a whimper, because this thing was so beaten. It was like a blazing fire that eventually burned itself out. And that was the end. And that was in February of 2006. So we have all hell break loose in September of 2003. The battle begins the beginning of 2004, reaches a peak in beginning of 2005. We continue through the exorcism later in the year, and it finally concludes in the beginning of 2006.
Yeah, I was wondering about the basement, too. I have that in my second on-air questions. These are things I jot down while you're telling your story. And one was did you have carpet in the bedroom floors? Because I was like going to make a little joke. The boy wouldn't let you in the room. Did he pee on the floor? But, you know, sometimes people pull up a bedroom floor and they find out there's a satanic symbol, or there's a floorboard loose and there's a body under the floor. These are kind of, you know, more satanic symbols more likely than the drama of a body. But in the basement, typically, it's an easy place to either build a house or a foundation without moving the graves. You can, you know, you don't crawl spaces unless you have a real basement. You can just build right over graves and not even know there's bodies there because of the nature of the build. But, you know, it crossed my mind about the basement. I almost wonder if that's relevant that it was held in the basement for the first time.
Well, I knew it was in the basement still because I saw it. It sometimes would appear as like a black fog, a shadow. There were other times it appeared in almost complete bodily form. So it would take these different shapes. I actually have a picture of it that's in the book. Our dog and our cat could see it, especially our dog. And for years it would go into what I called its terminal stare. It would sit at the doorway to a room, and almost like it was a pointer. You could see it was looking specifically, and then he would begin to bark. And I mean really bark, like something is right in front of him. So one of the time I had actually been up on the third floor, and I was taking pictures of this substance after it had appeared on the walls, and I was coming down the steps in the first floor, coming down. And as I reached the landing on the staircase and I turned, I saw the dog sitting at the bottom of the steps, and he had this terminal stare already, like he was looking at something on the steps before I even turned the corner. So I simply held the camera up in front of me towards him, and I took a picture. Didn't think anything of it. Went on with my business, and a couple days later, this was before cell phone cameras, my wife, you know, had the pictures developed, and she called me and said, "You're not going to believe one of these pictures." And here it is right in front of me. I was standing actually in the midst of it as I took the picture. You could hardly even see the dog. And it appeared in this case on the camera, and the picture is in the book. It's like a skeleton that's made out of like mist or a smoke. It's just so strange. They actually look like bones, straight bones, and I'm in the midst of this, like, almost looks like a cage of this smoke, misty smoke, but it's right in front of me. I'm in the midst of it as I took the picture. And so again, just some of the more bizarre things that this thing would do, and the shapes that it would take. And you know, as I said, at one point I did later, after the exorcism, I saw it in the basement. It passed in front of me, so I knew it was there. And I told the priest, we need to have Mass in the basement. Yeah. And so we took one room that I used as a workshop. It's actually on the other side of the room that is the furnace room, and it was large enough we probably had, 6 people or so there for the Mass. Mm-hmm. And as we were about to begin the Mass, our dog sat at the top of the steps. He was old by then. He couldn't negotiate steps, and he barked because he wanted to be. He was always present and sat with us during the Masses upstairs. So we brought him down, and he sat there for the Mass. And what was interesting during that Mass, during the consecration, from the furnace room on the wooden wall, during the whole period of the consecration, there was a knock on the wall, a continuous knock. Something was knocking on the boards. And you could hear it.
Not a pounding?
Not a pounding, a knock.
Okay.
And one of the guys that was there, his name's Kerry, he's in the book, he saw a figure of something like in the doorway. So we just continued on with the Mass, and after it was over, the dog was there, and I said that because it's significant. He kind of moseyed on into the furnace room and back this little hallway to the room that had been the coal room, where the coal was kept and where I generally kept wood for the furnace. It was empty at the time. And he went into his terminal stair, and he was looking at this thing, and it was in that coal room, and I saw it. And I told the priest, Father Mike, I said, it's in here. So we went into that room and began some very, very intense prayers, and we had the crucifix and the holy water, and that ended up being the final scene. And I don't want to give away the ending of the book, but
well, of course not. And I have to tell our listeners, these pictures are phenomenal that you're talking about. The pictures where the dog is looking up the staircase at the film that's just hanging over your face is just
you
palpable.
can see it, obviously. You have the book. Yeah.
Yes, I do. Exactly. And that's what I'm trying to tell our listeners. If they have any kind of curiosity about whether this is real, they need to get this book. The crucifix that you wore with the St. Benedict medal is not only bent nearly in half, the corpus is broken completely off of it, and it's dismembered. This was evil incarnate that attacked your family.
Yeah, there are other now that cross you're referring to, I used to keep that at my bedside. There's another cross there that is partially bent. That was a cross I used to wear. There's another cross that I don't have a picture of, or at least they didn't put it in the book. It was actually, it wasn't a crucifix where it had the body of Jesus. It was just a metal cross. Mm-hmm. It was folded completely over on itself, and when I tried to unfold it, it broke in half. But it actually bent that cross completely in half.
Oh my goodness!
So it would, my son Bobby had a gold cross he wore. We all wore crosses.
Yes.
But his cross could not, the chain to remove it, it wouldn't fit over his head. You had to actually, undo the clasp to take it off. On a regular basis, he'd wake up in the morning and it wouldn't be there. And we would find it laying on the floor. We would find it in the bed. One time we found it between the mattress and the box springs.
Wow.
And it would still be clasped too. The clasp wouldn't be undone. And how it did what it did. At one point in time, this particular rosary beads that my mother had given me, that came from Medjugorje. They had crystal rosary beads with a silver cross. It actually chewed the cross on that rosary. Chewed it like a dog, like a toothpick. The whole end of it had teeth marks in it.
That's horrendous.
When it was later being examined, I was showing it to the priest, and my friend Kerry was there, this attorney friend of mine, and he was holding the beads in one hand and looking at the cross, holding it in his right hand. And as he was watching and looking at it, the beads fell away from the cross on their own, just disconnected and fell away. And he was astounded. I mean, stuff like that happened to me all the time, but when it happened to him, he looked at me and he said, "This is all really happening." And I said, "Yeah, it is."
Oh, what true. A shock. What a shock. Now today, your children, did they discuss this with you?
Sure. I mean, they experienced all this. Now,
yes.
They were younger. My son Bobby still has scars.
I'm sure.
From this. Now how old is he? 28, 29. He's had some issues, since that time. He's, a very intelligent, young man. I mean, the social media that he has managed for the publicity of this book on Facebook and so on has just been, phenomenal, the job he's done. But, they all looked at what happened. It all affected them in different ways. They're all good kids. They're loving kids. We're a good, solid family, and we all came through it. Even as I write, for years after, I had like post-traumatic stress disorder, when it was over.
Sure. Yes.
Everything that happened.
That's understandable.
It was like, this thing, has it come back? Is it back? I was like nuts. And, I can remember, I was talking one day, for those that know this big movie that's out, Deliver Us from Evil, Ralph Sarsky, the police officer from New York that is in that movie. I didn't meet him, but I talked to him on the phone several times because The Exorcist came from New York and so on. And I can remember him talking to me on the phone. This was months after it was over. He said, you just need to settle down. You just need to chill out and settle down and understand that this is over. And I finally did, but for a good while I was like crazed because
it's easier said than done. You don't forget that kind of thing in months or years.
Yeah, I mean, for what we went through, and the intensity of what we went through, and occasionally, it's been years, 10 years now. 10 years ago, we were in the middle of this. There have been things that have happened over the years, intermittently. And we were told that, occasionally they may try to get back in. There's even a story that Jesus talks about in the New Testament about a house that was cleansed of a demon. And once it was cast out, the owners did not properly sanctify it, and it came back with, 7 more demons. So it's scriptural. So we just had to make sure that our house continued to be a holy place. And I'll just say that ominous room in the front, that was so terrible, that was the center of so much activity, that's where my wife and I, that's our bedroom. We sleep in that room, and it's probably the most peaceful room in the house. So that's a testament to what was accomplished.
I have to agree with you. Thank the Lord. God is good.
And we're coming to let's see here. I think like 4 minutes left in the show. So let's plug where people can buy the book. At least, a few people are wanting to buy it.
And you've also got a book signing event coming up too. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Obviously the book in the Pittsburgh area, the media was all over it, just because of, my notoriety. And then a number of those television reports, ABC, CBS, Fox News from Cleveland, they went viral, and television stations across the country aired them. So my book signings at this point in time are pretty much, in the Pittsburgh area. All the Barnes and Nobles have contacted me to come, and so many of the community libraries and so on. There's a lot of tremendous interest, in Western Pennsylvania for it. And slowly this book is gaining more and more interest across the country as it sells and more people read it, and we've been contacted by, movie producers and so on. But my goal was to write the book and tell the story and get it published. So it can be purchased in Barnes & Noble stores and bookstores, Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, Google Books, Walmart Books. It's pretty much everywhere. They put this book up for sale at the end of January for pre-order, and it wasn't published until August. And at one point in time, it was in the top. It broke the top 1,000 on Amazon, and it wasn't even published yet. It's The Demon of Brownsville Road, and my name is Bob Cranmer. They can type in either one, and it comes up. And it's a different book. It's not your average scary haunted house book. It's written in a very believable manner. There's a lot of background to the whole story. It's more a novel that tells a complete story of the evil and its origins and our family. And so if people are looking to be scared to death in the first 10 pages, that doesn't happen. There's a lot that goes into it, and there's a reason, because I think to make this book credible, I have to present my family and myself as credible. That we're normal people, and this happened to us. It's all true, and this stuff exists. And in my mind, my faith is no longer faith; it's reality. I've had my foot. I went through the telephone line, so to speak, in the Matrix. I've had my foot in the supernatural. I've experienced it, and this is no longer a matter of my opinion. I can say this is true, and evil and good and God and devil are all real, and people can have all the scientific opinions that they want. It's all as it's laid out in the Bible.
Well, we're sure blessed that you could join us here tonight. This was rather eye-opening for a lot of our guests. They're glued.
Thank you so much.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And
God bless you and keep
bless.
you and your family safe. If you would like, we do podcast all of our shows after the show. They are neatly clipped, edited, and available for future listening. Please check back at a future time. We also have many numerous resources available for sale in case you think you're haunted. You might be haunted. You're considering getting into demonology, which is a very dangerous thing. You can find, once again, The Demon of Brownsville Road available at your local Barnes & Noble, or I'm sure it's available on Amazon. Thank you so much for joining us, folks.
Good night. God bless.